Thank you, Riyadh. Pleasure to be here again. What I'm going to talk to you today a bit about is ESG, or environmental, social and governance, and how this might impact investments and, in fact, anything you're going to be doing in coming years as a large company seeking money from lenders or investors. So, first of all, we're going to talk a bit about ESG and tell you why it's important, what it means. Secondly, going on to talk about investors and lenders and why they're concerned about this and how they're going to be judging you. And then finally, a few brief thoughts on what you should be doing about this to prepare yourselves. So, what is ESG? Apologies for those of you who are already well aware of what ESG is, but I'm going to go with just some basic details here about what ESG is. So ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, and this is the central framework around which ESG compliance is based. And these three areas are the key topics which companies are generally expected to report on around the world. In future slides, we'll look into some of these in more detail, but there are multiple organisations around the world which set different standards depending on your industry, but they all revolve around ESG. So those are the three areas where these frameworks are mainly concerned around. And what's the goal of ESG? Well, the goal is to capture all non-financial risks and opportunities in a company's day-to-day activities. So this moves away from previous reporting, which is all about financial reporting, really. So it's adding another sort of string to the bow of reporting, giving investors and others much better information about what issues the company is facing, and also potentially what opportunities a company may be facing as a result of ESG issues. So, as this is a talk about the environment, there will be quite a few pictures of trees in it, as is traditional. In the three heads, environmental, social and governance. Environment, a bit more detail about what that means. So this is risks created by businesses which have a negative impact on air, land, water, ecosystems and human health. So this is quite obvious, but it's things like pollutions, emissions, the energy efficiency of your buildings, heat, cooling, how you're obtaining that energy, what are you doing about your carbon footprint, and if you have a large requirement for water, well, what are you doing with that after you've finished using it? Social, this is the company's impact on society. So this is fairly broad. It's not just your people, so your employees' development, their well-being, your labour practices, also things around perhaps qualities of your products if you're doing if they're available to the general public, your supply chain labour. So it's no longer where you would have to report on the fact if you are just subcontracting all of your work to somewhere which has lower labour standards. That was something which now you'll be needing to report on. Biodiversity, social mobility and community outreach. And then governance, well, this is how you make sure you are you're implementing all of these new things you're trying to do. So how the company is run, so shareholder rights, executive remuneration. But then this also goes into things like the diversity of your board and perhaps things like gender pay gaps, which you also now need to be reporting on. And then also your executive compensation. So is this, you may be talking about moving away from being carbon intensive, but if your executives are compensated by way of pure growth, for example, well, that's probably not going to be reducing the carbon intensity. So are the way you pay your staff aligned with the company's aims? Corporate behaviour, anti-competitive practices, corruption, a lot of those will be statutory. And then also diversity and inclusion and how you make sure that is reflected throughout the organisation. So, I mean, I think all of those three heads, I mean, there's not much people can disagree with there. But why is this interesting? Why are we talking about this now? Well, funders and investors are now increasingly asking for this information. So they are being required to report on that, and as you will have ascertained from some of those heads, it goes down the value chain of any organisation. So as a lender or as a fund investing in companies, they're having to report on the sorts of companies they are investing in. And the only way they can know that if those companies are collecting and reporting the same sorts of information. So funders and investors are increasingly asking for this information. If you are involved in a large multinational supply chain with someone like Unilever or something at the top, well, they will be asking for this information. So they will be wanting to know, what are your labour practices? What are your plans for reducing your carbon footprint? How are you going to be moving to renewable energy sources? What are you doing with water, with your water and your wastewater? If you're in professional services, we're seeing a lot of information now required in tenders and pitches, asking about what we're doing as a law firm, and the same is also true for any other professional consultancy. So I think clients are seeking in professional services for us to be aligned with their corporate goals, and that goes back to those three heads which I talked about initially. And then also, I think this is something which certainly we talk about when we go out to recruitment. Our junior lawyers and potential junior lawyers are interested in this, and it's important to them. And also, this is potentially a reputational issue as well if you don't do anything on this. So, in summary, it is important. And then some facts. I mean, this is. As I said, you can't really disagree with any of those things, but there are also some sort of fairly large numbers associated with this. So this sort of the ESG focused investing estimates ranged about $160 trillion. IFC reckons 23 trillion in growing markets between now and 2023. And Bloomberg reckons by 2025, 33% of all global assets will have some sort of ESG mandate around them. So if you're seeking money from any international lender, any international fund, these questions are going to be asked of you, and sort of shrugging your shoulders and saying, well, I don't know, is unlikely to be acceptable, and may result in either you losing the potential investor or you paying a premium for being seen as a higher risk entity. So I just thought I'd give you an example what we're doing as a firm. So we've been in Muscat for about 40 years, but we're a UK, London headquartered firm, and so this is extremely relevant for us. So we measured all of our pre-pandemic data and took that as our benchmark. We did things like electricity, water supply, hotel stays. We have sort of 4 or 5 offices around the world, and 4 in the UK as well. Where did this come from? Well, landlords, agents, our travel suppliers, our finance systems, and this was this was not available for all of our offices. So there was a fairly significant information gap, but that's something we'll be working on in future years. And then we'll go on to talk about this later, this scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, but this is how you divide up your emissions when you do this analysis. So for us, our scope 1 was fuels, refrigerants and company vehicles. Scope 2 was the purchased electricity. And then scope 3, this is the sort of slightly bits which you might not necessarily initially think about, are things like material use. Being lawyers, we get through lots and lots of paper, as you might imagine. Flights, we have a network of international offices, so there's quite a lot of management time spent doing that. Road and rail travel, as you might imagine. Commuting, employee commuting, so that is included in this analysis. And then waste disposal and what we do with our water. So this was a fairly expensive and lengthy process, but we had to do it because this is a kind of a word map of tenders which we're getting at the moment, and when we're responding to tenders to large government organisations, well, not just government organisations, in fact, virtually all sort of significant corporate organisations, they're asking to tell us to tell them what are we doing about ESG. What's our carbon reduction plans? And it's not enough to have a paragraph sort of saying, yeah, we are working hard to reduce our carbon footprint. It's what are your numbers at the moment? Show me the downward trend. Otherwise, we'll go to a consultancy who is better aligned with what we're trying to achieve. So, speaking as someone who works for an English-based consultancy, this is something we're spending a huge amount of time and money on. As I said, these are all things which we can all support, but we also have to do this. Otherwise, we would not be able to take part in tenders and would be less successful. So, a bit of detail. What are investors concerned about? So this is a bit of an alphabet soup here of acronyms, so my apologies for that, but there are many more, so you had a slightly lucky escape. So there are multiple reporting frameworks which spread across a variety of industries, multinational organisations, and sectors. So these are some of the main ones. You've got the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the EU taxonomy, which is shortly going to be published and put into force, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and then Dow Jones Sustainable Indexes. There are others as well. Now, you'll ascertain from that list that these look to be fairly sort of European and US focused, and that is true. But the reality is that many banks and funds are headquartered in those places. And so if they're being required to report on this, where their businesses' activities are taking place, will also need to be reported on. So that's one element of it. But then also, this isn't a purely Western approach. AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, has an ESG framework and requires its investments to comply with that. And then China is also now starting to require its companies to start publishing ESG information on its stock markets. So I think you're seeing this, and all around the world, this is increasing focus. We had a huge amount of coverage and concern over the COP26 last year. That will happen with the next COP27, and I think governments around the world are increasingly finding they're having to take this seriously, and it's about putting real requirements on its people and businesses to reduce their carbon intensity, and of course most countries have now put binding commitments to reduce their carbon intensity, so governments will have to put in place rules to make sure that happens within the timelines. So, how is this reported? So we talked about these ESG pillars, and how is this? How do you actually dig into that data, your businesses, and find out how they are operating within those frameworks? You saw when I listed what we've been doing as Trowers and Hamlins. Well, this follows the GHG protocol, which divides greenhouse gas emissions into 3 scopes. So that's why we have scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1, this is greenhouse gas emissions which comes directly from a company and its controlled entities. So stationary combustion, mobile combustion, fugitive emissions, which is less interesting than it sounds, and process emissions. So this is what your on-site, if you're manufacturing, what the emissions which emanate from that. So how would you reduce these? Well, it's fairly obvious really. Energy efficiency, transitioning your transportation towards electric vehicles, trying to reduce waste, increasing excuse me, and yes, moving towards more efficient solutions. Scope 2, this is emissions which come indirectly from the generation of purchased energy. So this is your electricity bill effectively. So for most companies, electricity consumption is their one and only source. Reductions, well, you can move to clean energy providers. So for example, in the UK, you can buy specifically a tariff which is specifically renewable only. Someone like Oman, which doesn't have a liberalised market yet, you've probably limited things you can do here, but you could perhaps look at a captive generation solution if you rooftop solar or something, if you have the right sort of facilities for that. Scope 3, this is the one which is slightly, which I think really broadens out the scope of what is being talked about here. So scope 3 is all indirect emissions, which are not included in scope 2. So this is upstream and downstream emissions, and it encompasses everything which is linked to a company's operations. So this is, as we said, as we looked at with our organisation, it's trying to encourage people to work from home maybe, because that will reduce the energy intensity of your office. And then also looking down your supply chain, people providing things to you, well, how do you make sure that they are also then working to reduce their carbon intensity? I think we've been talking a lot about carbon intensity here and carbon emissions. ESG is broader than that, but I think because of the net zero obligations which many governments have agreed to, and the binding emission reduction programs which governments have agreed to, carbon is an important part of ESG, and moving towards net zero is a huge focus of these of ESG reporting, and that's why a lot of it is around carbon intensity, albeit that carbon intensity is just one part of the E of ESG. So this is the GHG protocol is generally used across these frameworks for measuring ESG. One really important one, which I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about now, is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So this is one of the alphabet soup which I mentioned earlier, but it's an important one. It was set up by the G20 Financial Stability Board in 2015. Its members are pretty much the great and the good of the international business world. It's headed by Michael Bloomberg. And the reason behind this is that climate hazards present a significant physical risk to tangible assets. So I think the Bloomberg or G20 have sat down and recognised that if we do move to a 2 degree plus increase in average global temperatures, then that will have a catastrophic effect on a lot of businesses and their assets. So something needs to be done about this, if nothing else, for financial reasons. So I think these banks have realised that some of their assets might be at risk, and that's has concentrated their minds, and are now looking at ways to require businesses to reduce their carbon intensity and thus give us a fighting chance to meet the sort of the 1.5 degree average temperature increase, which I think most people seem to think would allow us to continue to live as we have expected to. So it also works to increase climate-related engagement between investors and the companies which they invest in, and it became to force in 2022, but is having a broader impact. So initially it was voluntary, but 2021 the G7 confirmed that they want it to become mandatory requirement for companies within G7 countries, and it's already becoming part of the regulatory framework in many jurisdictions. So the EU, across the EU, Singapore, Canada, Japan and South Africa, and New Zealand and the UK, it's going to be mandatory from 2023 and 2025, respectively. So to take the UK example, what does this actually mean? Well, it means that every bank, insurance company, large public traded company or partnership will have to report using the TCFD pillars. And this is fairly significant. So, again, similar to the ESG pillars, but it's governance, oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities, strategy. So, what are you going to be doing to deal with these risks? Risk management. How are you identifying and assessing climate risks? And then metrics. So, what metrics are you using to assess this climate-related risks? And then disclosing your Scope 1, 2 and 3 greenhouse gas emissions and related risks. One thing I would point out here is that we talked about Scope 1, 2 and 3, which I think is it seems quite reasonable. The ESG industry at the moment is talking about Scope 4, which is not yet in place anywhere, but it's what happens to things which you create after you've sold them. So this is, you'll have heard sort of large consumer goods companies perhaps trying to talk about what they do with your sort of television once you've bought it. Are they required to take it back and then recycle it? What about the sort of millions of tons of plastics which Unilever produces to contain shampoo and things? Are they responsible for what happens to that afterwards? So Scope 4 would be talking about that kind of thing. So what do companies have an obligation with relation to waste products which naturally result from their products? So Scope 4 isn't something you need to worry about yet, but it's something which the ESG industry is talking about. So it could get a lot more complicated and a lot more costly in the future. So that was TCFD. Just as another example, the LMA, which is the sort of standard form which a lot of loan agreements are put in place around the world, now has green loans, and we're actually doing one in Oman at the moment for one of the banks here, which is a bank-to-bank deal, but they're taking money from outside Oman with an obligation to spend it on green projects. So I think, unless these things, well, what the devil is in the detail, what is meant by a green project. But I put this as an example of another sort of entity which is taking this quite seriously. And again, the good thing about this, well, the important thing about this LMA process is that it requires third-party verification. So again, you've got to get an independent consultant in to say that yes, they did actually invest that money in a captive solar facility for a factory, to ensure that there is actually proper compliance with this. So, what should you be doing about this? That graph is Oman's CO2 emissions, which I was quite surprised actually. I don't quite know why it peaked in 2015, but it is reducing, it is reducing, which is a good thing. So, Oman signed up to the Paris Climate Treaty. It's put 2 submissions in. I think it is now agreed to reduce its emissions by 7%. I don't know if that's probably because it's already done that by the looks of that graph. But then we've got the CBO's issued a circular about mandatory compliance with climate change reporting. And then the CMA and the MSX have issued statements calling for the voluntary disclosures. So this kind of mirrors, I think, what has happened in Europe and America previously, where there was a voluntary process, and then that became mandatory in due course. But I think the issue here is that it's not purely a question for the CMA and the CBO. If you as a company do things outside of Oman, or indeed get money from outside of Oman, then this will probably hit you already. Before it becomes mandatory in Oman, it will become mandatory in New York, in London, in Frankfurt, and your funder or investor will be needing this information already. So because of the international nature of this, you're almost having to comply with whoever is strictest, rather than just relying on what you're able to do locally. I don't think this is going away. Certainly, I was in the UK a few months ago, and we for my meeting of the management of my company, and the whole focus of the discussion was on ESG and how we're going to deal with this, and what issues and opportunities it perhaps brings. So, as I said, banks, funders and investors are having to report on this, and they will require their investments to report on this too. Global supply chains, again, this is absolutely something which you're going to need to be dealing with if not already. I would say this can be an opportunity. Oman has been at the forefront of the recent sort of explosion in green hydrogen and the return of hydrogen to be a fashionable the fuel for the future. Oman's very well placed for that. It's got huge empty areas, it's got nice cold ocean, and quite a lot of sun, as we're all aware. So, it's very well placed for this. There's huge opportunities for retrofitting buildings, making sure that you have double or triple glazing, that your AC units are properly efficient, perhaps rooftop solar, maybe. And then, yes, rooftop solar, of course, there as its own heading. So, yeah, so for example, in the UK, we're seeing there's been a much higher rate of adoption of electric cars in the UK than in Oman yet. And we're seeing land prices around electricity substations are increasing, because that would be a good place to put car charging facilities. So there are lots of sort of things opportunities which will arise around this. So I think the first thing as a company, those of you who work in-house, you've got to determine the metrics which you're going to measure, which obligations you're facing now, and what do you think you're going to be facing in the short to medium term. So you absolutely don't want to be asked sort of by somebody to provide your ESG report with a couple of months' notice, because this will take a long time to get. You may well have to engage consultants. Getting this information out of your landlord can be difficult. So capturing data, not all that information is readily available. We had great difficulty finding sort of information about our AC efficiency here when we were reporting back up to London. So it can be a bit of a paper chase. And you may well need to create new systems or bring in new software solutions to make sure that you can capture this information on an ongoing basis. So problems. Well, I think certainly if the UK is anything to go by, it's accepted that many companies are ill prepared for this, and it can be quite a surprise. I think the challenges are, well, it's fairly specialised, so you might not have the internal expertise. There is a significant cost to compliance for this, and there are data collection issues. And I think also this kind of approach where your climate risk and focus on ESG becomes a really important part of the business. Well, that may require real organisational change. If you've got people at the top who think this is all nonsense, you can imagine some difficult conversations there. So that's all I wanted to say. Does anyone have any questions on this? There's a gentleman up there who was very...
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Many thanks for your presentation. You mentioned that some companies in the UK will be required to do ESG reporting. Can you elaborate a little more about that? Will it be just for equity companies that have equity listed, or also for bondholders or bond issuers?
Well, I mean, as you saw from the list, so all these companies will have to, on a statutory basis, report. Companies House is requiring information to be submitted already and is holding that. So I think, most companies, most major companies will have to be reporting, I think, and that's well. And similarly, if you're a bank as a bondholder, you'll be reporting as a bank. But is that the question, or?
No, it says publicly traded. Does it mean
I see what you mean.
Equity, or also if you have a bond or a sukuk listed?
Yes, I mean, a sukuk is a financial instrument, so that would not of itself require reporting. But when you are creating a prospectus for anything like that, then yes, you would have to, in the UK scenario, yes, you would need to be reporting on ESG elements of that transaction. At the moment, the statutory requirements are mainly in relation to listed companies, I think. But I think all companies will probably be required to do some form of ESG reporting.
Is there a timeline for that?
Yes, the UK. I'm not as expert on the UK situation, but by 2025, there will be mandated disclosure as against the TCFD requirements.
Thank you very much.
The lady.
Hi, thank you for the excellent presentation. I think very insightful. I hear that some of the European countries are going to mandate this by 2023. we want to hear more about the local stand. So we know that IFRS are also going to be linked with ESG reportings. How are we preparing in terms of readiness? I see that CBO is directing companies and encouraging them to do the ESG reporting. What is the collaboration between CBO, the Ministry of Commerce? What are the predictions around what is required from the companies in terms of,
Sure.
taking this forward?
Yeah, well, I don't, I'm sure they're working on it hard, but I'm not aware of anything coming in Oman, but we're often not made aware of things before they appear, are we? So I think, I know that prior to COVID there was a move to try and bring in some more building codes, update the building codes, which would have had a big impact on this, because that would have brought in much more energy efficient construction and perhaps would have led to some mandating of some of the retrofitting we were talking about. That was, I understand, put on hold. But in some ways I think I would emphasise at what I said at the end, in that whilst what Oman does is, internally will be important, and it'll be very good to sort of change attitudes and bring people on to considering this as part of their businesses. In some ways, this will be driven by what's happening in London and New York, particularly for companies who are looking outside of Oman. So in some ways, what Oman does, will be important for companies who purely operate in Oman, but larger companies will have to comply with what their funders and investors are doing.
Have you explored with at least with the Ministry of Commerce of what is coming, or?
I haven't had that opportunity yet, no. But yeah, maybe something which Riyadh you could explore doing.
Yes, thank you again for the presentation. One thing which most of these, as you stated, driven by European Union or the US, the current calamities of wars and the unexpected disasters in Eastern Europe, how would that defer the application of this? Because currently there is a massive shift because of the energy demand and going back to fossil fuels. Because most of the drivers for this are the fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So how do you foresee that? Is those dates are going to be shifted to accommodate this recent calamities or recent disaster in Europe? Or is it going to be actually proceeded because maybe not all the whole globe have the same challenge, like maybe America or maybe the Far East also, they have the same challenge. How do you foresee this impacting the dates which being set 25, 23 or whatever? Because I know EU is driving this was massively, but EU is in really a different scenario.
Indeed. Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. Currently, the unfolding tragedy in the Ukraine is only a few months old, and the timelines we're talking about here are short to medium term. So at the moment, I haven't seen any sort of suggestion that there would be derogations or movement of these deadlines as a result of the Ukraine crisis. But then you look at what is happening in Germany, which was 60 to 70% they relied on Russian gas. So and they're starting up their coal-fired power stations again. So if one of the planks of your ESG analysis of your company was to move to renewable energy next year, you might not be able to do that anymore because everybody else wants to do that, and the price would be uneconomic. So I think it will certainly cause problems with people's. Well, it'll create changes in the analysis which people are doing on their ESG impact. But at the moment, if the war spreads, God forbid, or it gets worse, then yes, I'm sure there will be impacts. But at the moment, I think there's probably there's several European countries who are very badly affected by the absence of Russian gas, but other countries are less affected. So the UK, for example, we still have gas, so we're not as affected. And there's also vast amounts of LNG now available. So the Qataris and others are rubbing their hands with glee, I'm sure, at this opportunity. Oh, sorry.
I have to advance to the mic, so.
You kidnapped the microphone.
Regarding reporting, you mentioned the GHG protocol. What about GRI reporting? And so that's one part of my question. The second part is, what if the company is going for a divestment and they don't have any form of data, like they don't have any form I mean, where do they start? You know, they have a timeline, so I just wanted to kind of understand more. Thank you.
Yes, GRI was another one I was going to mention. It's another group who provides another framework for analysis. In terms of if you don't have any information, well, I mean, you're not unique in that. We were exactly the same until two years ago. So there are consultants around who can assist you with this. You can appoint people to come and start analysing your buildings. But a lot of it you can do yourself. I mean, you'll know how much electricity you consume. You can also look at your policies around around your investments, what you choose to invest in or not invest in. I mean, obviously, I think for a country like Oman, which is the economy is still heavily focused on hydrocarbons. If you're an oil and gas company, well, you're an oil and gas company. I mean, you're never going to, if you continue operating the same way you are, there will be some carbon element to what you're producing. But for a company like I know you're from OQ. I mean, you've got your investments in green hydrogen and other things. So there's a lot of good stuff there. You can talk about trying to reduce your impact or move the focus of the organisation away from a pure oil and gas company. So yeah, but I think there's a practical bit which is getting some people in to look at the efficiency of your buildings and your energy use and the sort of AC units you have. But then there's also the strategic bit, which is partly for the company to do itself.
Hi, thank you for the insightful session. It was quite enlightening. ESG, other than the various sectors, one of the most important sectors which I think will be impacted is oil and gas sector. So is there any specific mandate which has been issued by the Ministry of Energy and Minerals or anything that they're looking out to bring out in relation to this ESG, considering it's going to be really important for all these downstream and upstream companies to focus on the carbon prints and other factors relating to ESG?
Well, I think, apart from the sort of strategic decisions which are being made to focus on the green hydrogen projects which we've seen, OPWP announced earlier this year that it's not going to do any more thermal generation, for example. So there's a lot of policy decisions have been made to move into out of a pure sort of hydrocarbon-based. Sorry, no, that's not true. To further diversify into non-hydrocarbon forms of business. And I know you've got EDO has been set up with a mandate to pursue these sort of new energy projects, and I know other big companies, PDO, OQ, they all have new energy departments which are looking at moving away from this. So yeah, I mean, I think the direction of travel is pretty clear, and I think the various elements of government in the Sultanate are doing quite a lot to move to greener forms of industry.
But because of these projects are linked to the specific companies, but is there any specific mandate from the government to introduce green projects into Oman, or any specific benefits being provided by the government for that perspective? Because we see most of these companies, probably because of the international locations and headquarters, are undertaking these green projects because in those particular countries where they're headquartered, there's ESG reporting requirements which require the Omani companies also to be fully different.
I mean, I don't think. Well, it is part of the sort of the Vision 2040 plan. I think is moving away from hydrocarbons, and in fact, the whole plan is really about that. You might say, but there are no specific exemptions or benefits on offer to companies who are seeking to launch. Let's use green hydrogen as the example. Similarly, there hasn't really been anything for the solar projects. But yeah, the solar example is a good one because the Middle East has really been at the forefront of moving away from a subsidy model for solar PV projects. Because of these vast kind of 1 gigawatt plus projects which the UAE and others put in, that was done without subsidy. Whereas throughout Europe, they were all heavily subsidised, those projects. So there wasn't actually a need for subsidies for solar PV projects in the region. They were able to stand on their own 2 feet. So yeah, I mean, in short, no, not really. I don't think there's any. I'm not aware of any sort of particular exemptions or incentives for these projects. I think there are quite a lot of policy moves to support these projects, and I know there's a huge number of green hydrogen projects being talked about. So I hope the government can give them the support they need. So who's nearest?
Thank you. Any insight about the carbon tax that's being discussed in EU? Because it will definitely impact the manufacturing sector and the export of Oman into Europe. This is one. Two, referring back also to Oman, it is part of our role as well in the dialogue between all the stakeholders, including the regulator. What we are missing actually, ESG has a big part of governance, right? And it's not only companies' governance, it's also at the country level. What we're missing is one governing body that follow up the environmental facts. As an example, when we report the CO2 emission, the authority we report to is the civil aviation. Another part on recycling, we report to the Environment Authority. Then you have CBO issuing by itself. Then you have CMA and MSX. So there's no one governing body to take forward this extremely important topic in Oman.
Yeah, thank you. Your second point, I would agree entirely. That would be hugely useful. Yes, and I think also some clear reporting standards and requirements in Oman for MSX, making that mandatory, would be very helpful too. In terms of the carbon tax, I'm afraid I don't have any particular insight on that, other than that I know it's been talked about. I think the lady over there has been waiting very patiently.
My question was mainly around how to prioritize your resources when you're starting out in ESG integration. As you mentioned, there's a range of reporting frameworks, disclosure frameworks, as well as different rating agencies too, like Sustainalytics, MSCI, as well as the international organizations that a lot of companies are joining, like Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Principles for Responsible Investment, and so on. So when starting out, how do you prioritize your resources as to what to focus on first? Do you, for example, as an investment company, do I prioritize joining the PRI, or do I focus on launching my first sustainability report, or do I have to get rated to baseline? So what would be your recommendation?
I don't know, I'm afraid. Well, it varies. It depends very much on your company and what you're seeking to achieve. I think it strikes me, well, from our experience with my company, getting your own information sorted out is really important, because then that also gives you an insight on what you may be asking other people to do. You know, if you know what was very difficult for you to obtain, and also then if you're asking people to do it, we say, well, we've done it, so there's no reason why you can't. So I think sorting out your own information is good, and that will then put you in a strong position to report, upstream if you need to do that. But I'm afraid it's hard for me to give it an answer, because it varies very much from company to company.
Maybe in the context of investment companies and what you've seen in the past, what would be your?
Well, again, I think by having your own ESG reporting done, I think that puts you in a morally strong position when you're asking your recipients of your money to do it, because you can then publish yours if it's published on your website, for example. But then, it depends it is very hard. It depends what your ambitions are. If you're purely Oman focused, then perhaps making sure you're complying or you're reporting against TCFD, for example, is perhaps unnecessary. But it very much depends on what your focus is and what your ambitions are, I think.
My name is Sultan Battari from the Ministry of Economy. My question is sort of government concern. We have a stock of around 34 bilateral investment treaties. And most of these treaties are silent about the interaction between investment and environmental protection and sort of. And they sort of imposed what they refer to internationally as a regulatory chip, not enabling states to regulate investment to achieve legitimate policy objectives.
Yeah.
So how do you see the interaction between these, I would say the future bilateral investment treaties with all these developments?
So, the possibility that rules in a country might be seen as a breach of a bilateral investment treaty. Yeah. I mean, it's possible. I mean, if somebody went really extreme, but bilateral investment treaties, I mean, the focus of them is fairness. So if you sort of imposed like extremely strict ESG reporting requirements on any company with more than 30% foreign shareholding, that's going to be a problem. But if you impose strict ESG reporting requirements on everybody, then I think it would be difficult to see how that would cause a breach under a bilateral investment treaty. So as long as things progress as you expect, then I would have thought bilateral investment treaties shouldn't be something which you'd need to worry about from an ESG perspective. Any more questions?
I wanted to ask you about the climate border adjustment mechanism. Does that affect us at all?
The climate
Border adjustment mechanism. It's this tax that anything that you, let's say, export to Europe, if it doesn't, if it has certain, carbon footprints, then you get tax on it.
Sounds very unfair. I'm afraid you've exposed a hole in my knowledge, so she's not invited again, Riyadh. I'm sorry, I'm afraid that's not something I know about.
Yeah, I don't know how it affects Oman, so I wanted to know if it affects us at all.
I'll do some research when I get back to the office.
I guess believe on the scoping you mentioned, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, if there is a transition between one scope to another, then body will be liable for that. So for example, if you purchase gas from EDO or BDO and put it to a processing, unless that get counted for, because
right.
you might push it to your customer in Europe or your customer in the Far East, and if you start charging you because of that, what the Parliament has mentioned, then that will be passed back unless somebody declare, no, I have offset it already by something.
Like a double taxation treaty.
Yeah, people who sit in the middle, like refinery or something. If they declare that they already offset that carbon footprint by this much, then will be exempted, because there is a notion currently where the buyers will actually put levies on carbon, because he or the other party have to offset it again because of the other EU, European, or the other law.
Yeah.
I think that would be passed down the lane. So if you're selling for, let's say, $50 a barrel, I'm just trying to be nice.
Yeah, you have to pay
So then that they might charge you 50 cents for lack of declaring your carbon footprint. But if you declare it and you say, I've captured it, already offset it, then that 50 cents will be put back on your bag. I think that's what the notion currently making up.
I suppose you need to ensure that this analysis is being done fairly and you're not double counting or not counting at all. But yeah.
But people, they don't talk something, but if you're allowed to say, for example, social element. Currently, insurance companies, they do offset, if you don't have any social unrest, they offset that in their claims, because the likelihood you will be putting claim against social unrest is not there. So if you have a very clear social responsibility, CSR strategy and policies, then you're actually accommodating that challenge. And we have experienced some insurance companies, they do offset against that. So if you present to them that I have everything, all the preventive control put in place, so the likelihood of incidents taking place is minimal, then they will consider that in your premium of insurance. So I would advise the gentleman who asked, maybe Oman is not there yet, but already actually, because you are purchasing from international system, and the internal system, if you tell them, although data, you might argue on the data quality and all that, but they still will give you that offset, and you might have a cheaper insurance if you have an ESG policy.
Exactly. One of the opportunities which ESG presents. Thank you. Anyone else?
I know there has been a framework for ESG, and this is to widen the base of the funders to complement in the public debt. So I just wanted to add that.
That's very positive.
And I came to this lecture out of curiosity because I heard about ESG from the people who are criticizing it, actually, not from this extent. So I want to learn more about how to respond to this criticism about hypocrisy and potential signaling and these things.
Well, I hope I've given you some ammunition to fight back against criticism of it. I suppose, I mean, there is the people who are now imposing this on the rest of the world have spent many decades ignoring this completely, which I guess is where the charge of hypocrisy comes from. But I think the science is pretty settled that the world is facing some pretty extreme consequences if temperatures are allowed to rise. So blaming there may well be a place for blame as to who's actually responsible for this. And in fact, your history of emissions is something which is taken into account in your required reductions, where the large industrialized countries are being required to reduce further and faster in recognition of what they've done in the past. But I think so that will perhaps play an element, but it's pretty existential for us to resolve this stuff now, whether whose fault it is or whether there's an element of hypocrisy in what's now being asked. And I think it's we're all going to be suffering immensely if this doesn't happen.